so happy to introduce Chip Carroll out of Southern Ohio, the USP, United Plant Savers Center up there. If you haven't been there, everybody needs to go on up. Give him a nice round of applause.
Thanks, buddy. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay without the microphone in the back? We're good? Great. So my name's Chip Carroll. Like Robert just mentioned, I came here from Southern Ohio on behalf of United Plant Savers. I'm also currently employed by another organization called American Ginseng Farm, and I've been fooling around with ginseng for almost 20 years. I started in college as just taking up an interest in forestry and then the herbs and then ginseng specifically. Started wild harvesting a little bit, and for the past 17 years I've been growing wild simulated ginseng on my farm. Over that time, over the last 20 years or so, I've worked for a couple different organizations, mostly nonprofits, and have been fortunate enough to be involved in some of this policy-related ginseng work, working on regulations, working with growers group, much like the group that's coalescing here today, doing the whole growers meetings things. And today we're going to kind of shift gears for a minute and just talk about some current trends, issues, and insights, or some things that are happening within the ginseng industry today that I think it's important for all of us to be aware of and at least have on our radar screen. Because some of the policy and regulation stuff tends to be a little bit abstract, I would encourage you all to please, we can make this more of a conversation, so if you have questions as I'm going through some of the stuff, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and interrupt me, and we can talk it out a little bit. So in general, just the presentation is going to cover kind of through my experience how we got involved and really got the growers involved in some of these regulatory and policy decisions and what that looks like today. It's kind of been an evolution over the last 10 years. And then talk about, again, some of the current issues that are being brought up throughout many different states that in the ginseng region, as well as being brought up by the Fish and Wildlife Service and other regulatory agencies that oversee ginseng management on a federal or state level. And then talk a little bit just about kind of the cultural stuff and where we're at today, what's going on in this increased interest in ginseng. So over time, ginseng's experienced several kind of boom-bust cycles, and that began in the 1700s when ginseng was first discovered in North America. So the export kind of heyday began, and a lot of interest was shown towards ginseng late 1700s, again, late 1800s. This is about the time people really started to grow ginseng as the wild populations became depleted. So you had so many people wanting to start growing ginseng in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there wasn't enough planting stock to accommodate that. And a pound of seed back then was selling for similar prices we see today, $100, $150 a pound. Of course, back in 1900, that was a significant investment for people. But you can see through some of these old advertisements how this idea of ginseng as an economic opportunity or as an income opportunity isn't a new idea. This has been going on for literally well over 100 years in this country, and right here in North Carolina, Ohio, West Virginia, throughout the range. So then in the late 1990s, we kind of see this reemergence of interest in natural products and herbs, ginseng moving back to the forefront. More and more people are becoming more involved in conservation and taking an interest in their woodlands. And ginseng's just a nice fit for forest landowners. So we've seen that increased interest come back again, and then in the last 3 years it's really kind of peaked with ginseng hitting the reality TV market and the price of ginseng actually hitting historical highs, all-time record highs. So a lot more people getting involved, and there's a good side to that, and then there's some negatives to that, and we'll discuss a little bit about both of those. Of course, today with the reality TV thing is a big concern for a lot of people. There's some measurable things that we've seen come out of this. So since the TV shows began, we've seen increased harvest pressure and more diggers. And that's reflected through states keeping track of people who sell ginseng root. So on those digger sheets that anybody who sells wild ginseng has to fill out, we've seen a lot of new names and a lot of new people in the last few years. And then we hear from the buyers that the quality of the ginseng is going down. So we have more and more people seeing this stuff on TV, thinking, oh, I can go do that, but not really being familiar with the rules, the regulations, or the best cultural practices for this. So we have a lot of people digging roots that are too young, roots that are too small, roots that should have been left in the ground for a little bit longer, or digging plants that aren't even ginseng in some cases. Ohio actually, one of the ginseng coordinators in Ohio got a email last year from somebody who was out in their forest, saw this television show, went out to dig their ginseng, and sent a picture of all the baby buckeye trees he had dug asking her if it was ginseng. So all kinds of mixed stuff going on here. But a lot of interest has come back also into this idea of conservation and genetic preservation. As more and more people are interested in growing ginseng, there's been a significant increased demand for seed. And as Janine mentioned in her presentation, most of the seed available to us today is coming from Canada and Wisconsin from those artificial shade gardens. And there's some concern being raised by a lot of universities and the regulators about this kind of cultivated genetics coming back into the forest and potentially having a negative impact on our native genetic ginseng. And it's a bit controversial. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's something that you're going to be hearing more and more about in the coming years, and we're likely to see maybe some policy changes in that regard in the future. So about the first place I really got involved in some of this regulatory policy stuff was in 2005 when, right before ginseng season started that year, the Fish and Wildlife Service was about to pass a rule that would have taken ginseng from a 5-year-old legally harvestable, marketable root and increased that to a minimum of 10 years old to be legally harvestable and marketable. The decision to do that was it's a really good idea. It makes sense that it would allow the ginseng plant more time in the wild, more time to reproduce, more seeds to get out. However, the way that decision was moved forward, the process wasn't so good. There was no public input and no input from the ginseng industry or the natural products industry. And because it was so close to ginseng season, there was a lot of concern from within the industry that rule change would have a very negative impact on the season that year. And then also we wouldn't have time to even educate diggers that rule change had taken place before season began. So we were lucky enough to be able to put together a group of representatives from the natural products industry as well as wild simulated growers from throughout the region. And we were able to meet directly with the Fish and Wildlife Service, who's in charge of the ginseng regulatory stuff on the national level, and kind of talk that out over a day or two and came to the conclusion that they would wait on the 10-year rule change and kind of table it to the future. And it was this kind of process that really got a lot of growers concerned, starting to see that there's going to be some of these rule changes coming up. And the big concern for wild simulated growers was that if there were a moratorium or an export ban put on wild ginseng, that we would no longer be able to market our crops out of the country. Does that make sense to everybody? So right now, wild ginseng to be exported has to go through a certain process, certification. And if the Fish and Wildlife Service, and a lot of people think that it probably will happen someday, we kind of thought it may have already happened, but it hasn't. If they ever put any kind of moratorium or restrict a state's ability to market their ginseng, because wild simulated ginseng is often sold as wild and into that wild market, that people who have intentionally planted the seed, grown it for 10 or more years, would lose their ability to legally market that root. So growers began to organize and started to meet more often and try to come up with some solutions to some of these issues. And a lot of these things are still kind of floating out there today and still being discussed. For instance, this year's findings, so the Fish and Wildlife Service puts out findings every year to determine the sustainability of the wild ginseng harvest. And they do that on a per state basis. So every year they make an evaluation to determine can North Carolina continue to export ginseng or not. And that's based on the information they get through ginseng sales. So some of the things that they've put into their findings for this year that they're interested in kind of further developing or seeing developed are trying to really get at this. How do we figure out what's a wild root and what's a wild simulated root? So the Fish and Wildlife Service looks at the amount of ginseng harvested from each state on an annual basis. And in a year where ginseng's getting $1,000 a pound, you see this massive increase in harvest and sales. Is that all coming out of the wild, or is that a lot of wild simulated growers harvesting their crops in a good market year and then putting it into the wild market. Well, Fish and Wildlife Service can't make informed policy decisions if they can't differentiate what's truly wild versus what's being grown, intentionally produced. So they're really trying to figure out ways to distinguish wild simulated from wild. And if you have any familiarity with marketing ginseng, as Janine mentioned early in her presentation, virtually impossible to distinguish. I would venture to say it is impossible to distinguish good grown wild simulated from truly wild ginseng. So there's some process that needs to take place here to figure out how can we make that happen? How can we make it maybe incentivize the grower or the producer to actually, when they take that root in for sale, say that I grew this. And if you've sold ginseng before, you know that a lot of diggers and growers in particular, won't go into a buyer and say, I grew this, for fear that the buyer's going to offer them less money, knowing that it's not truly wild ginseng. So right now, there's no incentive for a wild simulated grower to admit that they grew this ginseng. There are some ideas coming up, and I think as a domestic market in this country develops a little bit more, maybe consumers here will be willing to pay more for a wild simulated product than a truly wild product. And we're starting to see that shift in a few places. But this is something that's really important to the regulators and something that they'll be trying to figure out and move forward. Another thing that they put in their findings was this broader implementation of grower verification or ginseng grower certification programs. And that again comes out of this idea, if they put a ban or an export moratorium or a harvest moratorium on wild ginseng, if you're a certified or verified grower, maybe that will help you protect your ability to market because you can prove that you've intentionally produced this crop. And so this idea of grower certification programs has been in development for about a dozen years, and there's a few states that already have this implemented, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. The other thing that we keep seeing brought up again and again on both state and federal levels, there's a great interest in starting to require wild harvesters to have to purchase a license, much like a hunting license to dig wild ginseng. This is something we've been talking about in Ohio. I think the route that we'll end up going is some kind of nominal fee, like $10, to get your digger's license. One reason for this, and one reason I think it's a good idea, is that if you've ever sold ginseng, you walk into the buyer and you fill out that piece of paper that has your name, address, how much root you sold, and your signature. Well, then the next guy comes in to sell his root, and he sees your name, address, how much root you sold, and it becomes a bit of a privacy issue. And especially if you're a grower, you don't want people to necessarily have your address. By buying a digger's license, basically your name becomes a number. So you're in the system as a number, and when you sell your roots, you would just write down your digger's license number rather than have to give up your name. So that's one reason. The other reason that this is being pushed is obviously to help the regulators get a better grip on who's out there, that the ginseng's being legally harvested. And I think most importantly is that each state that has a ginseng program, it's an unfunded mandate for them to even have that program. So they're required by the feds to have this ginseng monitoring program, do all this paperwork, administration, keep track of the roots, report to CITES, report to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they're not getting any money to do that. So they have to generate those funds by themselves. And I can only speak to what's going on in Ohio, but basically a ginseng program in Ohio is spending a lot more money than it's bringing in. The only money it brings in is through ginseng root certification, which is a nominal fee, something like $2 a pound. So they're not generating enough money to basically implement the program the way it should be done.
Was there any look at doing moratoriums, differentiating between export and maybe keeping the domestic, focusing more on the domestic market so that the wild simulated would have an outlet, but the domestic market might be, or the export market might be a moratorium for a while or something?
Yeah, I'm not sure how that would break down. I think if they went, and the idea that folks have discussed, I'm not just making up things, there's been some discussions about this idea of a moratorium or a ban, and I think that would be on wild harvesting as a whole. So basically, whether that wild root was being sold domestically or exported, they would just shut down wild harvesting altogether. So then the only ginseng that would be able to enter commerce would be those that were intentionally produced or wild simulated. The real concern for the regulators and the Fish and Wildlife Service is the wild ginseng, the truly wild ginseng. A little bit about the grower certification idea. Kind of after that 10-year rule and the little fiasco and people starting to talk about moratoriums, a lot of states began to organize their growers associations and talk about this and try to come up with solutions. And in Ohio, we formed the Roots of Appalachia Growers Association. In West Virginia, the West Virginia Ginseng Growers Association actually worked with the legislator to create a ginseng grower certification program that was put into state law. So that in West Virginia is administered by the Division of Forestry, and a forester will come out and inspect your property if you want to become a certified ginseng grower. And they'll do that on an annual basis for a nominal fee, very low cost. And then basically the idea is once you're certified, you'd be exempt from some of those regulations. In the findings that the Fish and Wildlife Service put out last year, they actually held up this West Virginia model as the one they would be most interested in seeing move forward. So there's more and more states starting to talk about this, and it's interesting because it could go in a lot of different directions. Not each state necessarily has to do its own program. In Pennsylvania, this organization, Pennsylvania Certified Organic, has created the label you see here in the program, Forest Grown Verification Program. Now, this organization out of Pennsylvania, they'll drive all the way down here to North Carolina to certify you as a forest verified ginseng or herb producer.
There's the guy who's doing that, he lives right outside of Boone.
One of the
certifiers.
Great, that's great. So you already maybe have a certifier in North Carolina. The problem that a lot of growers run into with this is it's cost prohibitive. Until there's enough certifiers out throughout the region to reduce those travel costs, right now I would have to pay somebody from Pennsylvania to drive to Ohio to get me enrolled in this program.
Joe McCarty's just up in the Boone area, so he's real close.
So this is starting to gain traction, the whole forest grown verification, and I like it a lot because it's got a label, and it also has kind of opened up the doors for some of this domestic market development that we'll talk about here shortly. But just some things to be aware of. I know here in North Carolina you're talking about a lot of these same issues, so it'd be nice, just as a side note, back in the first two booms, the 1800s, the early 1900s, there were national ginseng associations, and each state had an association. And these people were meeting on a regular basis to talk about this stuff and come up with solutions collectively. So today we don't have a National Ginseng Growers Association. Doesn't exist, which kind of perplexes me. I think that's something we need to maybe think about moving forward. It's great that each state's working on stuff individually, but we really need to work together collectively if we want the loud voice. So again, West Virginia successfully did this certification program through legislative changes. They had a legislator who was interested in ginseng. They were interested, the Division of Forestry was interested in cooperating with them, and they made this happen. And the PCO, the forest grown, like I just mentioned, more like an organic certification program. So you're inspected annually. They want to see your receipts, documentation. They want to see the ginseng growing. They're going to keep track of your seed purchases. They want to make sure, and this again is some concerns coming from the regulators, that if you're verified and you've been planting, 10 pounds of seed a year, they want to see when you're starting to make sales that you're not marketing 400 pounds of root or something way beyond what you would have been able to produce. In other words, they want to know that that root's really coming from a cultivated source and you're not just collecting all your neighbor's roots and selling it into this program. So they want to be really good about kind of inspections and keeping up with your practices. Like I said, the PCO program is starting to develop this more high-value domestic market. There's been some mention of Mountain Rose Herbs. They're actually selling some of this forest-grown verified product. Here is a tin of theirs with, I believe it's like 3.5 grams of root in one of these tins, less than 4 grams of root, and $43. So, and the roots they're nice ginseng roots, but they're not those, prize ginseng roots. So talk about adding value to your product. And they're having pretty good luck marketing this stuff. Same with the ginseng leaf. Here we've got, again, just a few grams or less than an ounce of leaf, and they're getting $15 for that. Really nice presentation, but there's a lot of ginseng consumers and herbalists in this country that want to be able to use this plant, but won't because they're not sure it's coming from a sustainable source. So these markets are helping develop that.
What can you use the ginseng leaf for?
Everything you can use the root for. So it's got most all of the same properties as the root.
It's not strong.
Just not as strong. And a lot of people like to do the whole plant when they're doing medicine, do a whole plant extract, so they're including the leaf and the root. And again, Mountain Rose has actually developed that product now too, where they're selling the whole plant extract and doing pretty well with it. So I mentioned earlier kind of this idea of trying to distinguish wild versus wild simulated. And this is one that's going to take probably some cultural changes and some creative ideas to really figure out how do we encourage people to admit that they grew this root. It's been such a cultural practice for so long to say this is wild root for fear of not getting that premium price. So we've got to really be willing to work and figure out a way that they can start to determine those numbers and get a good picture of what's really happening out there. So right now the way it's set up on the state level is when you sell your ginseng, some states on their digger sheets actually ask, is it woods grown, is it cultivated, is it wild, or is it wild simulated? But for instance in Ohio, they just ask, is it cultivated or wild? So one of the problems we need to work on is getting all these states on the same pages with their definitions, with their paperwork, with what they're asking people to report on. And that would go a long way for helping the other regulators kind of move this forward in a way that makes sense. Any questions about any of that? I know it's a little confusing.
Can you repeat the name of the business that you said was doing the whole plant?
That's Mountain Rose Herbs, and they're a sponsor of this event and have some information out on the front registration table. So again, I mentioned earlier this idea of genetics and these concerns that are coming forward now. So there's been a lot of research done over the last 10 or so years, and as the ability to evaluate genetics gets better, there's more and more research and more people getting involved in some of this work. And basically what they found, at least through the research that I've seen, is that it's really, really mixed up. So you'll have, genetics from Missouri ginseng up in New York, and New York genetics down in Missouri, and Wisconsin genetics are everywhere, and Ohio genetics are everywhere. And basically what it tells us is this plant's been being moved around for 200 years. We all know that. 200 years ago people would trade roots, send roots up to Sears Roebuck, and they would send them seed for exchange. So these roots and seeds have been being moved all over for a long time, and it's pretty mixed up. And so that's where it gets a little bit controversial on the genetic stuff. Some people might argue, is there really even any wild ginseng left after you look at the past land uses in the eastern U.S. and the fact that most of the forests have been clear cut, some 2, 3, 4 times now. Wild ginseng, do we have a genetic marker from 200-300 years ago? No, we don't have that kind of baseline. So we're working with what we have. But again, the concern is because all the seeds coming out of these northern cultivated gardens, are we bringing diseases into our forests? Are we bringing a non-natural ginseng that's been under this intensive cultivation for so long now that it just isn't going to do good things in our forest? And it's kind of a mixed bag. But like Janine said, I think there's a real opportunity here, and we do also encourage people to source seed as closely to where they're going to be growing as possible, but it's really next to impossible because there aren't any producers producing enough local seed to supply the demand. So this is another place where there's a real opportunity for people who are just getting into this or want to expand what they're doing to become local seed producers. And so there's you basically, if you could obtain some native seed and start growing it out, it's going to take time, but eventually there could be a lot of small producers producing local seed to kind of take that concern away. And also, the few people who are producing regional seed now are getting premiums for it. I'm talking over $300 a pound, $400 a pound for seed, where the stuff coming out of the northern gardens is bringing about $100, $150. So there's a real opportunity and a real demand. Something to think about. And this is another picture that kind of shows that smiling seed we were talking about earlier. See how that seed coat's cracked open? You can see the embryo in there. Something to look for when you're buying your seed.
Is there any distance to maintain to avoid cross-pollination like you would with some seed from?
That's a good question. Ginseng can self-pollinate and also cross-pollinate. So
But maybe like one hollow over from the other one.
I would say that would be safe, and I'm no expert on that. But the other thing, as a grower of almost 20 years, I've seen is that ginseng adapts to its site pretty quickly. So it'll naturalize, and so seeds I planted 17 years ago are naturalized and reproducing on their own throughout the forest. And I've brought in wild roots and I've planted seed from here, and it's kind of a mixed bag, but everything, basically it's survival of the strongest. The weak plants are going to die out. You're going to be left with plants well adapted for your site, and if you can encourage seed production on those over time, I think you'll have a really good strain of ginseng for your particular site. Back to the emerging domestic markets. So this is kind of the real, I think, the real future of ginseng. The Asian market's obviously a high value market, but it could go away at any time. There's a lot of things that play into that market, and we saw in 2001 after 9/11, that market disappeared for that entire season. So geopolitical things and other things could play into that. And really, we've got this wonderful resource here. We should really be using it ourselves. I loved what Janine said about the Chinese fellow who was here for 6 months and said we should all be taking ginseng. I think it's true. We kind of send our best away, and we're left with the dregs or the worst of the worst, as far as ginseng is concerned anyway. So there's no better time for this than what's happening today. You see a lot of internet sales taking place. There's a lot of herbalists, again, practitioners, and consumers who want access to high quality ginseng, and they're willing to pay for it. I can, even in a bad market year, I'm getting at least $900 a pound for what I consider tincture grade ginseng root. So root that wouldn't really fetch a high price in the Asian market, stuff that can be chopped up and extracted, not the big old roots with fantastic shapes, but 8 to 10-year-old root. And we can get $900 regularly per pound just selling it to veterinarians, direct consumers, herb companies, and practitioners. You see this reflected here. This is an outfit out of North Carolina. Somebody might be in the room, or you may know these folks, but they always have roots for sale on Etsy. Really nice photographs. They kind of make it a little bit of an artistic thing and market that. So we got there 9 grams of root for $146. That's pretty good. You can let that thing float out there on the internet for a year until somebody buys it. And I think that these things actually do sell. I've done some successful marketing domestically just with small lots of wild ginseng or wild simulated ginseng.
I was just curious, but what do the veterinarians use the root for?
There's a whole group of holistic veterinarians in this country that are using herbs on their clients' animals. So I'm not sure exactly specifically, but it is actually going into that very small amount. Again, eBay, you see root sales, and this is crazy. This is, this time of year you can go on there every day and find these things taking place. I will say that I may mention it later in the show, but I'll just say now, you have to be familiar with your state and federal laws regulating the sale, transport of ginseng. So basically, if you're putting it online and there's a chance that it's going to sell out of state, it must be certified by the state before that happens. And so before you get in too deep down the hole of marketing, you really need to familiarize with all the regulations and laws. But you can see that they're getting really good prices for roots, almost above and oftentimes way above the export market. So challenges. So with the increased interest, and it sounds like you all here are experiencing the same things that we're experiencing in West Virginia and Southern Ohio, the ginseng theft. One thing we're actually working on now is trying to do away with that word poaching and just call it what it is and call it theft. Because oftentimes, and I've worked with growers who've had, several thousand, if not up to $10,000 worth of root dug off their property in an afternoon by a group of people. And this is becoming a greater and greater problem as the economic situation worsens and as, unfortunately, the substance abuse problem increases. And that's what we're dealing with a lot in Southern Ohio is people, in fact, the sheriff calls it now that they're out digging meth. It's kind of a sad thing. They don't even consider it digging herbs anymore, but they're digging these plants often off your private property just to go get their fix. So it sounds like, again, in North Carolina, this is something that's going on here. People have experienced some theft of ginseng.
I think that the biggest thing that I've seen as a dealer is that this doesn't start September 1 as the legislation tells you to. And when you looked at that trail, the trailer on those guys who were out there poaching and taking routes that they weren't supposed to take. They even say they go out early and they stay out late. And they're not talking about after September 1.
Right.
They're out there in May, in June, in July. And some of the reasons I believe the poundage has stayed the same is because of this early taking of the ginseng to get that poundage up to where it used to be when they used to just do it in season.
And so in Ohio, it's been a challenge for us because even when the grower is able to successfully catch ginseng, it's often hard to get a prosecution. We've had to actually go in and meet with judges and prosecutors to kind of teach them about this. It's oftentimes looked at as just a plant. And I've had cases that I've worked directly with where the judge will let the thief keep the ginseng and maybe declare some restitution, but oftentimes the folks taking the ginseng can't afford to pay the restitution anyway. So there's really a need for some education around some of this stuff, what's going on. The digging out of season is just terrible, and that's going to be, these types of things are what is going to move this kind of export or moratorium idea forward a lot quicker. And so I love what Janine said. I say this in every presentation. We can't any longer operate in the dark. You can't be a secretive ginseng grower. I encourage people to invite their extension agent out, see what they're doing. If you have a soil and water office, invite those folks out. Invite the sheriff out. Show them your ginseng, because if anything ever happens, it's great asset to know that these folks have actually seen what you're doing and you can prove it. Document it, save your receipts, take pictures while you're seeding, shoot video, make sure you get some big landmarks in the video so that tree or that rock, you can prove that that's where your ginseng was. And some growers are even able to get ginseng inserted as a rider on their homeowner's insurance. So some growers, depending on who your insurance company is, you can get your crop insured. And then of course you can start like an orchard producer would after you begin making some harvest. So after you plant your seed or plant your fruit trees, 10 years later when you're harvesting, you can start to take a tax deduction for this type of work and make it part of your agricultural effort.
I actually read in Scott and Jean's book, some people dye their roots. So when people take them, they have the dye on their fingers, and when they try to sell them, people can tell.
That's right, or the root has the dye on it.
Yeah.
And I know here in North Carolina, a lot of the buyers, are they required now, or is it?
It's voluntary.
It's voluntary. So a lot of buyers will shine that black light on that root to see if
And
it's,
show up.
yeah. And then you can trace it back to where it came from.
The gentleman who had started that program will be here this afternoon.
I understand that, yeah. Okay, so real quick, we'll just get to wrapping up here. I think we're probably getting close to being out of time. So, yeah, we're over.
1 minute.
All right.
Fine.
We held a meeting in 2014 at United Plant Savers, basically, again, bringing together all the stakeholders in the ginseng industry to try to hash out some of these ideas. And this is something that's going to continue to happen like we're doing today. I think this is where kind of the rubber hits the road and we can come up with some of these solutions and ideas. Some of the things that have come out of that meeting is kind of things to move forward, and I think some of this is already being moved forward. Connecting growers with domestic markets, researching organic production, right? We're talking about that today. I heard this mentioned earlier, recognition as a specialty crop. Can we start getting funding from the USDA, from other government organizations to work on this? Work on the local seed production, work on the genetic issues. Grower certification and stiffer laws for this ginseng theft. So, this is one worth writing down. This organization now, the Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmers Coalition, this is a great resource, whether you're a beginning grower or you've been growing for 20 years. This is a coalition of nonprofits, universities, and landowners, basically, who've come together. And the website, Appalachian Beginning Forest Farmers Coalition, has a ton of resources on there. You can go on the website, become a member, have access to all those resources, articles, videos, newsletters. And then they're putting on a bunch of workshops. I understand there's going to be at least one in North Carolina.
We do too. We'll have one-day workshop, is it March 10th? Right before Organic Growers School in Asheville. And then we're going to do one in the fall, a 2-day workshop like the standard ones we've been doing at Warren Wilson College in the fall.
Great, what a great place too. And these are really great opportunities to get together. meet some great people, networking, and really hear some folks that have a lot of experience share their experiences. So I'm really excited about being a part of this. I'm really excited for the potential of this coalition to move things forward. This coalition just started this year, and there's already 400 members. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of people involved in moving this stuff forward. And here's the website if you're interested down at the bottom. It's simply AppalachianForestFarmers.org. And just wrapping things up here, again, we're likely to see some of these policy changes coming down the pike. It's good to be aware of what the issues are and start working towards solutions now so nobody's caught off guard when things maybe happen. Talked about the documentation. Good time to consider this whole idea of becoming certified or verified as a grower, really protecting the efforts that you've put into growing this crop. 1 in 6 people on the planet regularly use ginseng or hold ginseng in high esteem. So this market's really unlimited. And every root that we can produce is one less of those wild roots that we have to worry about. Next year also, July 12th through the 14th, we're going to be cooperating with a variety of other organizations on hosting this event in Morgantown, West Virginia. So this will be a 3-day meeting of all of the stakeholders, the regulators, diggers, growers, NGOs, researchers, academics, universities. So we're all going to come together and we're going to spend 3 days together and we're going to solve all of the problems that we have. But no, really, this is going to be a great meeting. It's going to be robust and it'll have all of the kind of current events and trends and opportunities spelled out real clearly. So that's all I have for you for now. And if anybody has any questions, we're here all day as well. And I'd be happy to talk with you more specifically about any of this. Thank you.